Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are undertaking a mission, really, to get our heads around one of the most intellectually, well, contradictory and frankly provocative economists of the 20th century, Joseph A. Schumpeter.
Schumpeter is absolutely fascinating. An Austrian economist whose whole legacy, you could argue, rests on this foundational paradox. He was, on the one hand, capitalism's greatest champion, its most eloquent analyst,
Right.
and yet he delivered probably the most chilling prophecy about its future.
And that prophecy, of course, it's the big one. It comes from his 1942 work, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy. He just lays it out there, asks the question, can capitalism survive?
And it's his answer.
No, I don't think it can.
Yeah.
Just like that, unequivocal.
It's a really stark starting point, isn't it? It forces you right away to question your own assumptions about economic growth, stability, everything. So our mission today is to unpack the intellectual scaffolding behind that statement. We need to understand the core concepts he invented, obviously, like creative destruction.
Which we'll definitely get into.
But also the man himself, his influences, and they're huge, from Marx to Walras, and the profound historical context that shaped his uniquely pessimistic optimism. It's quite a mix.
Yeah, it really is. And for you, the listener, this deep dive is, I think, a crucial shortcut. Schumpeter fundamentally shifts how we analyze the economy. He pulls the focus away from this idea of static equilibrium.
Right. That neat, tidy world.
Exactly, where prices and quantities are all fixed and rational. And he throws us into this world of dynamic, sometimes turbulent change. It's all driven by innovation, risk, and, crucially for him, historical evolution.
He really teaches us that economic history isn't just, a background subject. It's not just about what happened back then. It's the absolute key to understanding why the engine works the way it does, and maybe, just maybe, why it might eventually seize up.
Okay, so to get into the complexity of his thought, we really have to start with the complexity of his life, right?
Yeah.
Where does he come from?
Well, you have to picture the setting. He was born into the sort of the twilight of the aristocratic world of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, late 19th century. His family background was in textiles, military officers.
So established.
Privileged.
Definitely privileged. He was apparently a child prodigy, and he possessed all the advantages of his class. He never really had to fight for access, to the elite institutions, unlike many of his peers.
That aristocratic background feels important, but it wasn't just privilege, was it? He combined it with this almost obsessive work ethic. His biographer, Thomas McCraw, talks about this intense academic routine. Started early, lasted his whole life.
Absolutely. He was intellectually ravenous, and he set out very deliberately to absorb different intellectual traditions. Early on, he spent quite a bit of time trying to become what he called the English gentleman.
The English gentleman, what did that involve?
Well, it meant intense study at places like the London School of Economics, the Inns of Court, and significantly spending long, long hours researching in the British Museum. Ugh, the British Museum. It's kind of amazing to think he was working in the same great reading room where Karl Marx had hammered out his critique of capitalism, a generation or so earlier.
It's a fascinating overlap, isn't it? And while he was soaking up this atmosphere in London, Schumpeter realized something important quite early on. He saw where the future was headed. He wrote, with really incredible prescience, that the future of economic science was shifting decisively towards the United States.
He saw that coming, even then.
Yeah, he recognized the changing global economic gravity long before many of his European colleagues did.
So this dedication to being a cosmopolitan scholar was key. But his personality, you mentioned contradictions, he wasn't always easy.
No, not at all. By all accounts, he was an absolutely marvelous conversationalist. Dazzling wit, sharp intellect, could hold court anywhere. Captivating, but also intimidating.
And that wit, it sounds like it sometimes backfired.
It did. Because he could argue any point from any angle,
Yeah.
sometimes just for the sheer intellectual sport of it. People often mistook him for a cynic. They thought he lacked real conviction, maybe sincerity.
The dangerous gift. Wasn't that what one of his professors called it?
Exactly. Eugen von Boombaverk, and we'll definitely talk more about him, called Schumpeter's intelligence and that rapid-fire rhetoric a dangerous gift from the gods. It perfectly captures that duality.
Brilliant, but maybe lacking a filter.
Something like that. Intellectually brilliant, but often interpersonally clumsy. A friend once said Schumpeter could be extremely irritating to the self-esteem of oneself. That combination, the privilege, the blinding wit, often used without much thought for feelings that cost him. He faced several professional setbacks because of it.
And speaking of contradictions, for a guy analyzing the intricate mechanics of markets and human economic behavior, he was famously impractical in his own life.
Oh, spectacularly so. It's almost comical. He seemed to view mundane, everyday tasks as just beneath him.
Like what?
Well, the basics. He never learned to cook, wash his clothes, drive a car, or even type his own manuscripts. Think about that, an economist writing thousands of pages, unable to type.
Wow. So he relied entirely on...
Entirely on support staff, secretaries, the privileges that came with his class and academic positions. It's a small detail, perhaps, but it underscores his separation from the practical, hands-on, bourgeois life he spent his career analyzing.
His professional life mirrored this sort of extremism too, didn't it? Very up and down.
Extremely volatile. He was a successful professor early on. That was his element. But then he took this detour into political life. He served very briefly as the Minister of Finance in Austria right after World War I.
And that didn't end well.
It was a disaster. Failed Minister of Finance. You have to remember, the context, Austria was in complete chaos. Political upheaval, economic collapse, hyperinflation.
A truly catastrophic time.
Absolutely. We're talking hyperinflation, the nation fragmenting, real deprivation. People literally weren't getting enough calories to survive. So after that political failure, he pivoted again, became an investment banker in Vienna. Let me guess, another spectacular failure. His bank collapsed amidst the ongoing post-war crisis.
Minister of Finance, failed. Investment banker, failed. It's quite the resume.
It is, but what's fascinating is how he viewed it later. We often see failure as just failure, a setback. But Schumpeter found meaning in it.
How so?
Years later, looking back on the failed ministry, the failed bank, he said something really profound. He claimed he didn't regret them because, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, each one of them taught me something about life and about myself, which a uniform success would have concealed.
Wow. So the failures gave him insights he wouldn't have gotten otherwise.
Exactly. He learned about the sheer force of history, of sociological currents, things that pure abstract economics just couldn't capture on its own. He saw the limitations of theory when faced with real-world chaos.
And this realization, this need for a broader view, it was cemented by a personal tragedy, wasn't it? 1926.
Yes, 1926 was the absolute turning point, the true wrenching intellectual catalyst for his later greatest work. He suffered an absolutely devastating triple loss in a very short span of time.
His mother.
His mother died, yes. And then, tragically, his beloved second wife, Annie, died in childbirth, along with their newborn son.
Just unimaginable, that level of trauma.
The sources describe his grief as immense. He apparently wrote that he felt like a soul condemned to hell. It's incredibly raw. There's even this passage where he documents his wife's final moments, describing the expression of torture printed in her eyes, but then finding somehow an aesthetic beauty and a composed majesty in her coffin, with the child in her arms. It's intense.
And that profound heartbreak, it pushed him intellectually.
It seems to have driven him away from the sort of cleaner confines of pure mathematical economic theory. He started searching for a new intellectual home, a kind of creative fusion. He wanted to meld rigorous economic theory with the much broader scope of sociology and history.
Because he realized
that economic actions, the choices people make, the decision to innovate, to risk capital, to invest these, aren't just driven by rational calculation. They're driven by societal structures, by psychological impulses, by deep historical forces that those neat, static models just ignore.
And that desire to blend the disciplines, that's what gives his major works, like Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, their unique power.
Precisely. That's what makes him still so relevant. He wasn't just an economist. He was trying to be a social scientist in the broadest sense, understanding the whole dynamic system.
Okay, that transition, that drive towards a broader view, leads us perfectly into his methodology. To really get inside Schumpeter's head, you mentioned his huge, unfinished posthumous work, History of Economic Analysis. What was the core idea there about economic history?
His fundamental conviction, really the bedrock of his approach, was that the current state of any science, but especially economics, implies its history. You simply cannot understand modern economic problems, the methods we use now, the results we get, without making that implicit history explicit.
So it wasn't just about, tipping your hat to the old guys.
Not at all. For him, it was a matter of essential intellectual hygiene. You had to know where the ideas came from to understand their strengths, their weaknesses, their hidden assumptions.
And this is where he saw economics as different from, say, physics or math.
Exactly. He drew a really sharp contrast there. In physics or math, generally speaking, results build neatly on each other. Old concepts that are forgotten are usually forgotten because they were proven wrong or they're perfectly encapsulated in the current state of the art. You don't lose much by ignoring the detailed history.
But not so in economics.
Definitely not, according to Schumpeter. He said he found instances that were little short of appalling, where genuinely valuable results, really important insights, or crucial perspectives had just been shelved or forgotten for centuries, only to be rediscovered much later, often without realizing it was a rediscovery.
So if you're studying physics today, you don't necessarily need to go back and read Newton's Principia in the original Latin.
Right. But Schumpeter argued that if you're an economist and you ignore Adam Smith, or maybe the early French physiocrats, you're actively losing out on stimulating, essential, and often overlooked ideas and suggestions that are still relevant.
And this ties into his point about the uniqueness of economics as a subject, right? The subject matter itself changes.
That's a vital point for him. Because the economy is a unique historical process.
Yeah.
It's constantly evolving. Economics in different eras is dealing with fundamentally different sets of facts, different problems, different structures.
So the challenges facing, say, 18th century mercantilist traders are just structurally different from the challenges of 20th century, maybe monopoly capitalism or today's digital economy.
Precisely. An economic truth or a dominant theory in one century might become irrelevant or even misleading in the next. Not because the original theory was logically flawed necessarily, but because the underlying structure of society, the technology, the institutions, they've all changed completely. This dynamic view of history is the absolute foundation for his whole theory of change.
Okay, speaking of change and historical forces, let's talk about his great antagonist, but also, as you said, his inspiration, Karl Marx. This relationship seems really complex. It started back in those seminars in Vienna.
Yes, those famous seminars under Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk. They were legendary, hotbeds of intellectual combat, really. Young, brilliant economists wrestling with the giants of thought, especially Marx.
And Schumpeter was right in the thick of it.
Deeply involved. He studied Marx incredibly intently, and he came away with this very nuanced appreciation. He saw Marx as both a fundamental inspiration, because Marx had the sheer audacity to try and build a comprehensive system explaining historical change.
Which Schumpeter admired.
He admired the ambition, the scope, but he also saw Marx as an eternal intellectual antagonist, someone whose ideas he constantly had to grapple with, react against, refine.
So what specifically did he take from Marx? What did he value?
He highly valued Marx's concept of ideology, the idea that systems of thought, economic theories included, are often, maybe always, ideologically charged, that they reflect the biases, the prejudices, the interests of a particular group or class, like Marx's analysis of the ideology of the industrial bourgeoisie.
Schumpeter thought that was a major contribution to social science.
A huge contribution, a crucial tool for critical analysis. But, and this is the classic Schumpeterian twist.
There's always a but.
Always. He pointed out what he saw as a critical irony, a fundamental flaw. Marx himself was, in Schumpeter's view, completely blind to the powerful ideological elements within his own system.
So Marx was great at spotting the biases in capitalism's defenders, but not in his own revolutionary theory.
That was Schumpeter's critique. He admired the tool Marx created, but believed Marx failed to apply it universally, especially to himself. So, ultimately, Schumpeter drew a very clear line. He deeply respected Marx's economic sociology.
Meaning his analysis of class, historical change, the structure of society.
Exactly. Marx's structural view of history, his analysis of class conflict, his historical materialism. Schumpeter saw all that as essential for understanding why capitalism evolves and why it might face challenges. He thought Marx asked the right big questions about the system's trajectory.
But the pure economics.
He largely dismissed Marx's pure economics, specifically things like the labor theory of value, which tries to ground all economic value in the amount of labor needed to produce something. Schumpeter, steeped in the newer marginalist school, considered that theory, and others like it, basically obsolete from a technical standpoint.
Okay, so that brings us neatly to the modernizing forces he did champion. If Marx was the sociological influence, the mathematical school was his theoretical ideal.
Absolutely. When Schumpeter got to the University of Bonn, he made it a personal mission to make names like Leon Walras, Vilfredo Pareto, Notebook, the core figures of the mathematical marginalist school, commonplace in German academia.
And Walras was key for him. Why Walras in particular?
He saw Leon Walras's concept of general equilibrium as the single most important achievement of the whole marginalist revolution, the movement that also included people like Jevons in England and Menger in Austria.
We should probably pause and explain general equilibrium. It sounds important, but maybe a bit abstract.
It is abstract, but it's critical for understanding Schumpeter's big move. General equilibrium is essentially a mathematical snapshot of a perfectly balanced, static economic system. Imagine every single market for every good, every service, every type of labor, every raw material, all functioning simultaneously. Supply perfectly equals demand everywhere. All resources are allocated in the most efficient way possible. Walras provided the rigorous mathematical proof that such a perfectly balanced state could theoretically exist.
So it's like a blueprint for economic perfection, a system completely at rest, everything solved.
Exactly. A beautiful, elegant, but fundamentally static map. Schumpeter saw this as the absolute pinnacle of pure economic theory, a necessary, rigorous baseline. You had to understand this theoretical possibility of perfect balance.
However,
Exactly. However, Schumpeter's entire life's work, everything that makes him unique, was dedicated to explaining precisely why the real economy is never actually at that point of perfect equilibrium. Instead, it's constantly being violently pulled away from it by disruptive innovation, by creative destruction.
Okay. So he needed the static perfection of Walras's equilibrium as the backdrop against which his own theory of dynamic, disruptive change could play out. He needed to define stability before he could explain instability.
Perfectly put. He needed the rigorous, static framework of Walras to define the very stability that his own theory of dynamic change would constantly shatter.
And this emphasis on pure, rigorous theory, it connects to his views on scientific objectivity, right? Value-neutral analysis.
Yes, very strongly. He was a staunch advocate for value-neutral analysis in economics, trying to separate the us from the ought. He was actually very self-aware about the challenge. He acknowledged that our initial intuition, what he called the image of things as we see them, is almost always intrinsically ideological.
Meaning we can't help but see the economy through the lens of our own hopes, fears, or political leanings.
It's incredibly hard not to. It's difficult for any economist, any social scientist, to objectively distinguish how things actually are from how they want them to be or how their social group perceives them to be.
But he had faith in the process.
He did. His faith lay in the scientific method itself. He argued that the established norms of scientific investigation, gathering data, rigorous testing, logical deduction, peer review, these things naturally tend to correct for those initial ideologically conditioned errors. The facts, as he put it, eventually impose themselves on his scheme, forcing the honest researcher to discard or modify preconceived biases that don't fit the evidence.
So it's a pragmatic approach. Focus on the work, not endless navel-gazing about methods.
Exactly. He had little patience for what he called the futility of concrete achievements. That happens when intellectual energy gets bogged down in constant, unproductive methodological discussions about the one true way to do economics. His goal was always practical. Use the sharpest tools available, whether from history, sociology, mathematics, statistics, to understand reality as best as possible, not just to judge it or to promote a specific agenda.
Okay, let's move on to the book that really cemented his popular legacy, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. Published in 1942, right in the middle of World War II. It's kind of amazing, isn't it, that he apparently considered this incredibly profound analysis of Western civilization to be just a popular book?
It is remarkable. He apparently intended it as a bit of a distraction, something relatively quick to write, maybe in 6 months or so, while he was bogged down in his much larger, much more technical, and frankly, much drier works on economic history and business cycle theory.
He clearly underestimated its impact.
Massively underestimated it. But it contains his most enduring, his most debated, and certainly his most provocative argument. And it's built squarely on the foundations we've just been discussing, that blend of history, sociology, and dynamic economics.
So how does he start the argument in the book?
He begins, quite deliberately, by affirming capitalism's unprecedented historical success. He doesn't shy away from praising it. He argues forcefully that it has lifted standards of living for the masses faster and more comprehensively than any other system ever devised by humankind. He gives capitalism its due.
But then comes the twist.
Then comes the immediate, jarring pivot back to that central thesis, that core question, can capitalism survive? And the answer, no, I don't think it can.
It's this paradox that the system is destroyed not by its failures, but somehow by its very successes that just grabs you, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That's the engine driving the whole book. And it's crucial to understand his primary goal, as he saw it, wasn't really to predict a specific date for capitalism's collapse. He wasn't playing prophet in that sense.
So what was the goal?
His main aim was to explain how the capitalist system actually works in all its messy, dynamic reality, and then to show why its own internal logic, its own functioning, inevitably leads to conditions that undermine its survival, to explain its inherent fragility because of its success.
Okay, so central to that explanation must be how he actually defined capitalism. It wasn't just about markets, was it?
No, not at all. He viewed it as something much, much bigger than just the mechanism of supply and demand, or market exchange. It wasn't just, as he put it, about a housewife choosing between buying peas or beans at the market, or a manager deciding on quarterly production targets.
He used that phrase, a civilization.
Precisely. He called it a scheme of values, an attitude toward life, a civilization. And then he specifies the civilization of inequality and family fortune, that specific combination of values, attitudes, economic mechanisms, and social structures.
And his conclusion about that civilization.
His conclusion was blunt, that this particular civilization, this unique historical configuration, was rapidly passing away. It was eroding from within.
Let's unpack that phrase, though. The civilization of inequality and family fortune. It sounds almost deliberately provocative today when inequality is so often framed as the system's biggest problem, its pathology. Schumpeter seems to be saying inequality is functional, necessary.
He absolutely saw it as functional, even necessary, especially for the dynamism he prized. For Schumpeter, you have to ask, what motivates the radical, disruptive, truly game-changing innovations that characterize capitalism, particularly in its earlier, more heroic stages? The kind of innovations that completely overturn industries and create entirely new standards of living for everyone.
What's the answer, according to him?
The motivation has to be immense. The potential rewards have to be astronomical. Nobody, he argued, is going to risk absolutely everything, their capital, their reputation, their entire future, overcoming massive resistance, dealing with huge uncertainty, working relentlessly just for a modest, predictable return.
They need the prospect of hitting the jackpot, of creating vast, transformative wealth.
Exactly. They need the chance to build a family fortune, something significant that can last beyond their own lifetime, secure their family's position for generations. That, for Schumpeter, was the specific cultural and sociological engine. The possibility of achieving that spectacular, unequal reward and the desire to establish that family legacy, that's what compels the archetypal entrepreneur to face the monumental challenges and risks of true innovation.
So if policy steps in to eliminate or drastically reduce the possibility of that kind of unequal transformative reward through high taxes, regulation, redistribution, what
It
happens?
fundamentally damage the engine. You eliminate the dynamism itself. He wasn't necessarily saying inequality was good in a moral sense, but he was defending the specific structure of incentives that, historically, had produced the best material results for society as a whole, even if one of the byproducts was significant social stratification.
So it's that mix again, objective analysis of how the system worked, combined with maybe a personal regret that the social conditions producing those results were, in his view, inevitably fading away.
I think that captures it perfectly. He valued the output, the incredible economic progress. But he seemed to almost mourn the specific social conditions and the type of heroic individual that produced it, precisely because he believed those conditions and that type of individual were doomed by the system's own evolution.
Okay, when you talk about the giants of economic thought in the mid-20th century, the name that inevitably comes up alongside Schumpeter is John Maynard Keynes. They were contemporaries, right? Rivals.
Absolutely. Major contemporaries, major rivals. They moved in similar elite intellectual circles, particularly at Cambridge. They knew each other, interacted, and shared this intense, sometimes prickly, but often respectful professional rivalry. They were the two towering figures of their time in many ways.
And Schumpeter's critique of Keynes, it wasn't exactly hidden, was it? He wrote that obituary in 1946.
No, not subtle at all. That 1946 obituary of Keynes is a remarkable document. It's essentially a book-length article, a really detailed intellectual assessment and critique, published shortly after Keynes' death. Schumpeter knew exactly what he was doing. He acknowledged in the piece itself that criticizing the recently deceased, almost universally lionized Keynes was politically difficult, that he risked offending a huge, sympathetic audience.
But he did it anyway.
He felt compelled to. His intellectual convictions demanded it. The core theoretical split between them, the fundamental disagreement, really boiled down to a difference in perspective on time.
Time. How so?
Keynes was overwhelmingly concerned with the short-term crisis. His focus was on unemployment, lack of aggregate demand, the immediate problems of the business cycle, particularly the devastating slumps like the Great Depression. How do we fix things now?
Whereas
Schumpeter's gaze was fixed firmly on the long term. He was interested in the decades-long, century-long dynamic evolution of the capitalist system, driven by waves of innovation and structural change.
And Schumpeter felt that Keynes' intense focus on fixing the short-term problems actually obscured or even damaged that crucial long-term engine of capitalism.
That was precisely his argument. He believed Keynes's short-term crisis management fundamentally misunderstood the nature of capitalist development.
What was the specific critique of Keynes' diagnosis of the problem, say, during the Depression?
Schumpeter pointed out that Keynes, even relatively early in his career, he mentions Keynes being around age 37, writing things like, the economic consequences of the peace after World War I had already developed this view that the capitalist system was inherently prone to stagnation, that it was heading for, as Schumpeter characterized Keynes' view, permanent starvation due to a chronic lack of sufficient investment opportunities.
So this idea that the economy naturally tends towards underemployment unless the government steps in to stimulate demand. Schumpeter saw that as a core, maybe flawed, assumption in Keynes' work.
Yes. He argued that this underlying belief in inherent stagnation, the idea that capitalism left to its own devices would sputter out, never really disappeared from Keynes' thinking throughout his career.
So in Schumpeter's eyes, Keynes wasn't so much a savior of capitalism, but more like a very skilled short-term repairman who fundamentally misdiagnosed the patient's underlying condition. He saw the cyclical downturns as symptoms of long-term decay, whereas Schumpeter saw them differently.
Exactly. Schumpeter viewed cyclical depressions not as a fundamental failure of capitalism, but as a necessary, albeit painful, part of its functioning. They were part of the cleansing process of creative destruction.
Explain that link again. How does the depression fit into creative destruction?
In Schumpeter's view, the downturn, the slump, is when the old, inefficient, outdated firms and methods are forced out of the market. They collapse. This process, painful as it is for those involved, frees up resources, capital, labor, managerial talent that can then be reallocated to the next wave of innovation, the new industries, the more efficient processes that are waiting in the wings.
So by focusing solely on smoothing out those short-term crises, trying to prevent the destruction part.
Keynes, in Schumpeter's view, was inadvertently delaying or muffling the necessary destructive element that makes way for creation. He was trying to prop up the old structure instead of allowing the new one to emerge more quickly.
Okay, but let's bring in the counter-argument here, because this is where the real policy tension lies. The classic Keynesian defense is often summed up by that famous quote, "In the long run, we are all dead." If millions of people are suffering right now from unemployment and poverty during a depression, does clinging to a theory about long-term dynamism justify inaction? Doesn't the short run matter immensely when people are genuinely struggling?
That is absolutely the crucial moral and political question, isn't it? And Schumpeter's response was, well, characteristically unsentimental, but intellectually consistent with his framework. He believed that Keynes's writings and the policies they inspired cultivated what he called an intellectual broth, where anti-capitalist attitudes could flourish, even among people who weren't socialists.
How so? What did he mean by intellectual broth?
He meant that Keynes provided a highly respectable, sophisticated academic justification for widespread government intervention in the economy. Before Keynes, large-scale deficit spending or monetary manipulation was often seen as fiscally irresponsible, maybe even radical. Keynes made it seem necessary, scientific, even prudent, especially during a crisis.
So, in effect, Keynes made it intellectually acceptable, even fashionable, for non-socialists, for people who fundamentally believed in private property and markets to support policies that, from Schumpeter's perspective, were actually undermining the long-term structural integrity of capitalism.
Yes, that's exactly it. Schumpeter saw the practical outcome of Keynesian ideas as dangerous because they offered a ready-made intellectual toolkit for government intervention without requiring anyone to adopt an explicitly socialist ideology. It weakened the system's defenses from within, he thought.
And this brings us back to Schumpeter's point about the price of progress. He argued that the very policies Keynes encouraged, policies designed to boost demand, smooth out cycles, maybe reduce inequality in the short term, were in fact structurally anti-capitalist.
Yes, because, as we discussed with the civilization of inequality, Schumpeter believed that short-term instability and inequality were the necessary price society pays for the phenomenal long-term increases in living standards that only dynamic, innovation-driven capitalism can achieve.
So if you constantly interfere with that process.
If you constantly interrupt the cycle with demand stimulation, if you tax away the potentially huge rewards needed to incentivize radical innovation, if you prop up failing firms, you erode the very motor of that long-term progress. The social policies, however well-intentioned, designed to alleviate immediate suffering were, in his view, inadvertently undermining the system that generated long-run abundance.
Schumpeter's deepest fear, then, seems to have been the policy danger. Having lived through the Austrian hyperinflation after World War I must have influenced this. He feared that Keynesian ideas were just too appealing to politicians.
Undeniably, he saw Keynesianism as dangerously seductive for politicians who, almost by definition, operate on short electoral cycles. Keynesian policies offered tools that could deliver immediate, visible results, jobs created through government spending, economic activity boosted by monetary easing, a sense of prosperity, however temporary.
Things politicians could point to before the next election.
Exactly. Schumpeter feared this would encourage any policy that increased public spending or involved monetary manipulation, regardless of its long-term consequences or underlying merit, simply because it delivered short-term political gains. He was deeply concerned that resorting constantly to inflation and deficit spending wasn't just bad economics. It was actively destroying the bourgeois social order by corrupting its money, undermining savings, and making rational long-term economic planning impossible.
Okay, so we've established the man, his intellectual background, his key rivalries. Let's pivot back now to his positive analysis. The actual engine of change he described. We absolutely have to talk about creative destruction.
Yes, this is the absolute cornerstone, the heart of his theory of development. Schumpeter defined creative destruction, and it's worth getting the phrasing right, as the process of industrial mutation that incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one.
So it's not just like firms competing on price for the same product.
No, much more fundamental than that. It's not about marginal improvements. It's about revolutionary change. The introduction of a completely new method of production, the opening of a new market, the development of a radically new product, or even a new way of organizing a business. Something that renders the old way of doing things not just less competitive, but potentially instantly obsolete.
Like the classic example, the automobile industry didn't emerge from carriage makers just making slightly better wheels or faster horses.
Exactly. It was the invention of a fundamentally different system of transport that utterly destroyed the existing carriage industry, while simultaneously creating dozens of new industries: oil, rubber, steel, highways, motels, you name it. Innovation, for Schumpeter, is fundamentally discontinuous. It arrives in bursts, it involves enormous risks, and it always requires overcoming massive institutional inertia and social resistance.
And he made that point, didn't he? That the big successful enterprises driving this often don't just respond to existing consumer needs, they actually create the markets they then dominate.
Yes, that's a critical insight. They, in large part, create what they exploit. Think about the smartphone. Was there a huge pent-up demand for pocket-sized supercomputers before Apple launched the iPhone? Not really. Apple created the device, and in doing so, revolutionized communication, entertainment, commerce, creating demand that hadn't existed before. They changed consumer habits.
And here comes the Schumpeterian paradox again.
Yeah.
The very success of this incredibly powerful process, this creative destruction, contains the seeds of capitalism's own potential decline. How does that work?
This leads to that fascinating structural shift he foresaw: the gradual obsolescence of the individual entrepreneur.
Wait, how can that be? If innovation is the engine, how does the innovator, the entrepreneur, become obsolete?
Because, Schumpeter argued, as capitalism matures and becomes more successful, the process of innovation itself changes. It becomes routinized. It becomes bureaucratized.
Meaning
Meaning the lone, heroic, almost swashbuckling individual genius, the person who risks their family fortune, bets their entire life's work on a radical, untested idea, that figure gets replaced by the corporate structure. As firms grow larger and more complex, research and development, R&D, becomes institutionalized. It's handled by large teams of salaried scientists, engineers, market analysts, working within established bureaucratic procedures.
so the spirit of enterprise, which was once the defining characteristic of a specific risk-taking, often aggressive class of individuals, gets diluted. It becomes just another function performed within the organization.
Exactly. The heroic entrepreneur is replaced by the efficient manager, the specialized team, the committee decision. The individual owner-innovator is replaced by the dispersed shareholders and the professional executives of the large corporation. It's a crucial shift from person to function.
And this bureaucratization, this scaling up of innovation has profound political consequences in his view.
Absolutely profound.
Yeah.
Because the question becomes, who is left to defend the system? Schumpeter argued that once that original heroic, highly individualistic entrepreneurial class fades away, the new class of bureaucratic managers and specialized technicians are very good at their jobs, very efficient within the system.
Like,
But they lack the deep ideological conviction, the personal stake, the quasi-aristocratic ambition, maybe even the sheer willingness to fight that's needed to vigorously defend the core values of that civilization of inequality and family fortune. They are, at the end of the day, employees. Highly skilled, highly paid employees perhaps, but employees nonetheless, not owners in the old sense, not system-building revolutionaries.
and compounding this loss of the system's natural defenders is another force of decay he identified: the changing nature of property itself, the move towards abstraction.
Yes, the abstraction of property. Schumpeter observed very acutely that the shift from owning tangible assets, owning your own farm, your own factory building, a physical warehouse full of goods, to owning abstract financial instruments, primarily stock shares in large, anonymous corporations, fundamentally changes the psychology of ownership. He famously said it takes the soul out of the idea of property.
Takes the soul out. What does that mean in practice?
It means ownership becomes depersonalized, distant, abstract. If you own, say, 100 shares of some giant multinational corporation you've never visited, represented by a number on a screen, do you feel the same visceral need to defend that property, that system, with the same passionate conviction as the farmer defending his ancestral land from seizure, or the early industrialist defending the factory he personally built from the ground up?
Probably not. The connection is different.
The value is abstract, derived from a fluctuating market price, not from tangible control, personal creation, or intimate connection. It's easier to be indifferent, easier to accept policies that might erode that abstract value.
Okay, so we have the obsolescence of the entrepreneur, the abstraction of property. What was the third major force driving this decline?
The rise of a critical, often hostile intellectual class. This is another paradox, because a large bureaucratic corporation needs highly educated managers, technicians, lawyers, communicators. Capitalism itself creates, educates, and subsidizes a vast class of intellectuals.
People like journalists, academics, policy analysts, writers.
Exactly. And this class, often removed from the practicalities and risks of actual business creation, frequently develops a critical stance towards the very system that supports them. It's structurally easy for intellectuals, Schumpeter thought, to focus on the system's flaws, its inherent inequalities, its messy cycles of destruction, its perceived injustices, rather than its overall productive power.
And this intellectual class then provides the ammunition, the arguments, the intellectual broth we talked about earlier.
Precisely. They provide the critical narratives, the anti-capitalist arguments that make it culturally and politically easier to implement policies that regulate, tax, and ultimately dismantle the core incentive structures of the bourgeois system. This intellectual class, often working in tandem with the ever-expanding bureaucratic state, acts, in Schumpeter's rather harsh view, almost like an internal parasite, weakening the host from within.
Wow. Okay, one final piece of the engine we need to touch on: the role of credit. You mentioned it was crucial.
Absolutely critical and often misunderstood. Innovation, especially the radical kind Schumpeter focused on, requires enormous expenses, as he put it, long before any significant revenue starts coming in. Think of developing a new drug, building a new type of factory, launching a whole new technology platform.
Massive upfront investment, huge uncertainty.
Exactly. Which means that routine credit, the kind of loan a bank gives against existing collateral based on past performance, is totally insufficient for funding radical innovation. That kind of credit is for managing existing operations, not for creating something entirely new.
So what is needed?
What's needed is what Schumpeter called the creation of credit. This isn't just lending existing savings, it's banks or investors essentially creating new purchasing power, taking a significant risk, placing large sums on the table based entirely on a bet on the future success of a novel, unproven venture. It's funding the destruction of the old by financing the new.
So this ability to create and allocate large amounts of speculative capital is fundamental to the whole process.
It's an absolutely essential component of the dynamic capitalist process and also essential to the economic theory that seeks to explain its power, its growth, and also its inherent volatility. Without this mechanism for funding novelty, the engine of creative destruction would stall.
Okay, so putting it all together, the Schumpeterian model is this incredible, complex machine. You have a system driven by relentless, dynamic, disruptive innovation, creative destruction. But that very success leads to structural changes.
Right. It leads to bureaucratization, the decline of the individual entrepreneur, the abstraction of property.
Which in turn weakens the system's defenders and fosters a critical intellectual class that actively undermines it, all while relying on a sophisticated credit system to fuel the initial innovation.
And this entire intricate mechanism, paradoxically, contains the seeds of the system's own slow, perhaps inevitable transformation or demise.
It really sets the stage perfectly for future deep dives, doesn't it? We could look at creative destruction in today's digital markets or dive into his pretty controversial views on democracy, seeing it not as the will of the people, but more as a competition for leadership among rival elites.
Absolutely. There's so much more to unpack with Schumpeter. His ideas continue to resonate and provoke debate in so many areas. #DEG outro.
So, looking back at Joseph Schumpeter, his legacy really is this fascinating blend, isn't it? A kind of profound intellectual optimism combined with a deep cultural pessimism.
I think that's exactly right. He had this unwavering faith in the power and the limitless progress of the inquiring human mind. The belief that we can always improve our understanding of economic and social reality through rigorous analysis. Science progresses.
Yet he paired that intellectual optimism with this deep, almost mournful skepticism about the long-term fate of the very civilization, the capitalist civilization, that he believed was most responsible for unleashing that scientific and material progress.
He genuinely seemed to value the dynamic, messy, aggressive, and yes, unequal system that he called the civilization of inequality and family fortune.
Yeah.
He analyzed his power brilliantly, but he simultaneously watched, almost helplessly, as the internal forces it generated, bureaucracy, rationalization, intellectual critique, seemed to be steadily eroding its foundations.
And that brings us right back to that final, incredibly relevant, provocative thought we touched on earlier. Schumpeter warned, way back in the 1940s, that the shift from tangible property to abstract stock ownership takes the soul out of the idea of property.
And look where we are today. We live in an era completely dominated by intangible digital assets, by incomprehensibly vast and abstract financial products, by algorithmic trading moving billions in microseconds, by cryptocurrencies. Property itself is becoming more abstract, more dematerialized, more removed from physical reality than even Schumpeter likely could have imagined.
So the question he forces us to ask now becomes even sharper. In this new landscape, this hyper-abstract financial and technological world where ownership is often just lines of code, complex derivatives, or data streams, how much soul, how much of that visceral connection and commitment actually remains in the ownership structure of modern capitalism?
And perhaps more importantly, who precisely is left with the conviction and the standing to defend a system whose foundational values and concepts, like property itself, seem increasingly disconnected from the tangible lived experience of most of its participants?
That is definitely something worth pondering, isn't it? As those engines of creative destruction keep churning, reshaping the world around us.
Indeed it is.
Well, we'll leave you with that thought to chew on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the contradictory, frustrating, but undeniably brilliant mind of Joseph A. Schumpeter.